The title of the webinar today is The Helen Keller Dilemma, Workplace Discrimination in Vision and Hearing Loss in America. It's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce our speakers this afternoon. Dr. Brian McMahon is a professor of clinical rehabilitation counseling at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, a rehabilitation psychologist by training and a nationally certified rehabilitation counselor. Dr. McMahon has worked as a clinician, healthcare administrator, counselor, educator, and rehabilitation researcher for more than 45 years. Dr. Philip Rumroll is a professor of counselor education and director of research and training in the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. Being considerably younger than Dr. McMahon, Dr. Rumroll has worked in the field of rehabilitation for only 30 years. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Brian McMahon and Dr. Phil Rumroll.
Well, thank you.
As we say, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Bauer. This is Phil Rumroll, and very glad to be with you all today. I want to add my welcome to everybody. Brian, I think we've got around 400 of our best friends with us here this afternoon. It is this afternoon in the Eastern time zone, but good morning, good evening, whatever it might be to everybody who's tuning in live or who's going to be accessing the archived version after the fact. We are glad to have your support, and Walt, we want to thank you and Brandon and the entire team at HDI for making this presentation and this and our part in the HDI Spring Seminar Series possible. And Brian, a special thanks to you for joining us today on the program. Welcome to HDI. I think this is your first program you've done with us, and we're looking forward to a good time this afternoon. I will be, you see Brian there on the video, and you see Dr. Bauer, right? Walt, are you on video as well?
Yes, I am.
I was going to tell you Brian is the handsome bald guy, but that wouldn't narrow it down very much. Not handsome, but I'm a bald guy too. It happens that I'm calling in by phone today. I happen to have a visual impairment, and as an accessibility matter, it's easier for me to telephone in and work off the slides in that way. And Brian, you had indicated a few minutes ago that you didn't think it'd be a great hardship for the audience if my visual likeness was not represented on the screen today.
That's correct, Bill.
Very good, very good. So we're going to go ahead and proceed. The title slide is up now, Brian, if you wouldn't mind going to the next one. Okay. So Walt mentioned the title of our program today, and you know, when people do a research project, it's not uncommon for the project. In fact, it's really required that the project is guided by a research question. Well, we have a slightly different wrinkle on research question here that was the impetus for this particular study and for our presentation. And our curiosity that drove this particular study was prompted by a question that Brian and I didn't generate, but it's one that was posed many times to Helen Keller throughout her life. Helen Keller was a deafblind, as most of you all know, and she was truly America's original disability advocate. And because she was both blind and deaf, she was often asked, if one of your senses could be restored, which one would you choose? And I think embedded in that, embedded in that question is the notion of, is it more difficult to be blind or to be deaf? Or at least, what are the differences experientially between, you know, the sensory losses in those two areas? And we have verbatim here. Helen changed her responses to varying degrees throughout her life, but this quote was taken from, we think, 1930, and it's the one that is most widely cited. And Walt, I was wondering if you would be willing to read, for the benefit of the entire audience, the verbatim quote that goes after the title of this particular slide. This is Helen Keller's reply to the question of, if you could have one of your senses restored, which would it be?
Absolutely.
Walt, please.
Sure. Helen's reply. I am just as deaf as I am blind. Problems of deafness are deeper and more complex, if not more important, than those of blindness. Deafness is a much worse misfortune, for it means the loss of the most vital stimulus, the sound of the voice that brings language and music, sets thoughts astir, and keeps us in the intellectual company of man. End of period.
Circa 1930, keep that in mind. I'm sure if Helen were living in today's world, she might have a very different response. She might have used different words to describe her experience. We don't know. We also suspect that among the 50,000 plus United States citizens who are currently both deaf and blind, that if we ask that question to all of them, Brian, we'd probably get somewhere around 50,000 different answers. So this has a subjective and personal meaning as far as that goes, and we're not going to be able to fully answer that question about the overall experience of hearing loss and vision loss. But in our work with the Americans with Disabilities Act, a database from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, we study issues of workplace discrimination. And talking about this question that Helen Keller considered it many times throughout her life, we modified that question. We did become interested in comparing the workplace discrimination experiences of people with vision loss to those of people with hearing loss. And so our ADA version of this question can be stated as follows. Which of these two sensory conditions accounts for more behavioral manifestations of social injustice on the part of employers, in this case, in the form of workplace discrimination? So how do the workplace discrimination experiences of people with vision loss differ, if at all, from those of people with hearing loss? And if they do differ, what are those differences? And folks, we have the answers for you, and that is the purpose of our presentation today. Brian, next slide, please. Been working with Brian for a long time, and when we do presentations together, he always tells me to keep it brief, keep it simple. This program is not a primer on the Americans with Disabilities Act per se, although we'll get to some specific issues and provisions as we go through the program. But here in 2 sentences, we'd like just to establish a foundational basis for what it is we're talking about when we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the subsequent ADA Amendments Act of 2008. And 2 things we think are really important to emphasize, and this may be all we need to know to proceed to the operations of this particular study. Number 1, all personnel actions, when we have it bolded, meaning all personnel actions of covered employers, must be unrelated to the existence or consequences of disability. Period, full stop, as our president is wont to say, right? It really is that simple. Now, of course, some of those personnel actions, if they are based on the existence or consequence of disability, have more severe implications than others to both workers with disabilities and to employers, and we'll get to that shortly. The next sentence, number 2, everything in the Human Resource Manual, every aspect of how employees are hired, trained, retained, treated, disciplined, evaluated, terminated from employment, everything in the manual is subject to, every procedure and practice of the employer is subject to reasonable accommodation, provided that accommodation is necessary and, of course, reasonable. So that's the backdrop for what it is that we want to be studying today and looking at the workplace discrimination experiences of people with hearing loss and vision loss under the ADA. Next slide, please, Brian. Now, Walt, would you be willing to just visually describe the graphics in this slide?
I can. We have starting from the left of the slide, we have a picture of a number of different viruses. And in the middle of the slide, we have a picture of the American flag. And on to the right of the slide, we have a picture of the coronavirus.
Well, if it's just the image, you might be wondering how that fits into a discussion of workplace discrimination. But long before COVID-19 came about, ladies and gentlemen, the National Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, ADA research project was established in 2003 as a public health research project and community of practice. And what do we mean when we talk about public health, and what does this have to do with virology and the current coronavirus? Well, given the long-standing and just simply agreed upon association between paid employment and good health, quality of life, every desirable social outcome that you can think of, we view the employment of people with disabilities as a public health matter. When more people with disabilities are engaged in the workforce, the disability community is healthier. Our society is better for it. And workplace discrimination, we view in an epidemiological context as an insidious and un-American virus or disease. It has all the characteristics of an infectious disease. And as we've learned in the COVID-19 era, when society is affected by a scourge that is as rampant as COVID-19, and in fact, as insidious as workplace discrimination, you have to do several things to correct the problem. First, you have to understand the etiology of the condition. What is the underlying cause? What are the symptoms? Who is affected? How does it come about? What is its impact to the individual and to society? And what is the cost of treating the condition? What is the cost of not treating the condition? And we can only develop interventions or vaccines or inoculations, if you will, by thoroughly understanding the underlying disease. And folks, we do consider workplace discrimination to be a disease, one that needs to be reduced, and in some ways it has been, but eliminated, and in other ways it has not been. And we have a long way to go in that regard. We've made a lot of progress since 1992, when the ADA came into effect in terms of employer responses to disability in the workplace. But the disease of workplace discrimination is alive and well, and we continue to seek new and improved ways of understanding the phenomenon of workplace discrimination so that we can intervene with it and eventually stop it. And if you're not convinced that this issue of workplace discrimination is alive and well, for lack of a better way to put it, in 2021, we would commend to your attention a book called The Boys in the Bunkhouse, published in 2016. And this book chronicles the largest class action verdict that was ever awarded by a jury, Brian, correct, under Title I of the ADA. And this involved a situation going back to the 1970s when residents of a state school or institution in the state of Texas were recruited by a turkey processing concern in a couple of plants in the state of Iowa. And these were 30 or 40 all male, mostly African American people who were presumed to have intellectual and developmental disabilities. I say presumed because it turned out that several of them didn't have disabilities at all. They were incorrectly identified. And they were sent to this community in Iowa where they worked for 40 years in this turkey processing plant at sub-minimum wages and under deplorable and abusive working and living conditions. And it wasn't until 2012 that this came to light, thanks to the good work of a social worker who was assigned to work with a couple of the workers. And a long story short, a long and involved class action lawsuit ensued. And you got to read it to find out the results, but you'll read it and you will conclude that we still have a long way to go in our quest to make sure that the American workplace is as equitable and inclusive as it possibly can be. So we would refer you to that to look over at your own on your own time. So let's talk about the EEOC, the National EEOC ADA research project. Doesn't have a great acronym in terms of sound. We're going to call it NEARP hereafter. And we have access to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's Integrated Mission System database, 823,536. Brian, I'm sorry, next slide, please. Unique and closed allegations of employment discrimination under Title I of the ADA from 1992 through 2016, 23 and a half years of data. And we have case level data on the 800 plus thousand allegations that have been filed. There are, Walt, I'm going to ask you to describe this, this function chart here, just in terms of its shape, if you wouldn't mind, for everybody, and then I'll fill in the details.
Brian, do you want to describe
Walt?
it? Do you want
Either one.
Sure, this is the nature of the data collected. We have data about the charging party. That's how we refer to the person who has filed an allegation of discrimination at the EEOC. They're not clients, consumers, patients. The proper term is a charging party. We know some things about them, the impairment, age, and ethnicity, and their gender. We know where the allegation, as Phil called it, all personnel actions, the unlawful personnel action was alleged to have occurred, which is the employer's location. We know a few more things about the employer. We know the size of the workforce, and we know their industry designation, though we're temporarily prohibited from using that field. Most important probably is this list of 24 types of discrimination, which we're not going to read all of them, but you can see some of them deal with getting a job. Most of them deal with work conditions, and some of them deal with job retention. Those are what the EEOC calls issues. So issues is the short term for the personnel actions that are suspected of being unlawful. And finally, we know what the outcome is of the EEOC's investigation of each and every case. We only deal with closed cases in this over 800,000 field. And you'll see that a closed case ends with either merit. There are different types of merit. Merit means the charging party was successful in verifying that their claim likely was a discriminatory act and may be entitled to a settlement or compensatory or punitive damages, but it's a finding that discrimination did occur. And if the case, on the other hand, to the right of that is no cause or closed on a technicality, meaning no cause, meaning there's insufficient evidence of that this personnel action problem rose to the level of actual discrimination, the EEOC makes a finding in favor of the employer. So good now to remember those terms. A merit claim favors the individual. a non-merit claim favors the employer. And Phil, I think I've covered that. And with that, I'll go to the next slide for you.
Yes, thank you, Brian. I appreciate you going through the graphic. I was wondering how I could have you describe the graphic without doing the bubbles in between. So I'm glad you did that. Thank you very much.
The arrows show that all of these factors interact, and that's what makes the research really exciting and much easier and more interesting to do. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yes. So, and the key takeaway there, folks, is we have information at the case level on the characteristics of the person making the allegation, characteristics of the employer, the type of discrimination alleged to occur, and the outcome or resolution by the EEOC at the end of that process. Thank you, Brian. And we're on to the next slide. A little more on the NEARP project. We view, and we hope you will too, as a true and vigorous research collaborative, interdisciplinary in every sense of the word. Brian got the ball rolling on this back in 2003 through an interagency personnel agreement between himself, Virginia Commonwealth University, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Since that time, this project has yielded more than 90 published articles, either in press or in print, describing of a wide variety of studies that we will talk about here in just a moment. We've had 95 unique co-authors and collaborators who have contributed. And Brian, unique is the word. Some of them are more unique than others, I think, but we've made a lot of friends in the last 18 or so years in this endeavor. And those 95 authors have represented 22 colleges and universities throughout the United States. And we're always looking to add more folks to the team. If anything we talk about today jogs your interest or piques your attention or your curiosity about workplace discrimination in this database, we'd love to have you contact us. The more the merrier. I think Brian and I are proudest of this next bullet here. We've had 12 completed doctoral dissertations that have come out of this project. So it's been a great way to involve new and young researchers who are getting started in their careers. This is population level data, which is very difficult to get. So when we're talking about this particular phenomenon of workplace discrimination, we're not talking about samples. We're talking about the whole universe of formal allegations to the EEOC. And that brings with it some interesting methodological and statistical considerations. That makes it interesting in that level as well. This project has leveraged more than $6 million in research support from federal and private foundation sources. And today, Brian's continuing to work with us on the project. And I, a couple of years ago, became the administrator of this data set that we have. So we have this project now housed at the University of Kentucky Human Development Institute. Currently, most of the support for that is coming through a grant from the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, which has become very interested in the experiences and discrimination of people with MS and other chronic health conditions, and in cooperation with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. So through the latter connection, we have access to data regarding the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the American Community Survey, Brian, the United States Census. And so we're part of a larger collaborative of folks who are investigating these large federal and national level databases. So we're continuing in earnest as the ADA Amendments Act continues to unroll. There's going to be a series of studies looking at the implications of workplace discrimination pre and post COVID-19 when we get the 2020 and 21 data up to that point. So we're looking forward to that and would be happy to have any or all of you who are interested to come and join us in this endeavor. Next slide, Brian. We'll give you a little bit of what the kind of what our research kind of focuses on within this broad concept of workplace discrimination. As I mentioned, we look at characteristics of charging parties, and those are the people with disabilities who make the allegations, we'll refer to them as such hereafter, and employers, so we can look at the characteristics of the people making the allegations and the employers who are the respondents or targets of those allegations, those who are alleged to have discriminated against the charging parties. The issue or type of disability, the type of discrimination that is alleged to have occurred. Brian said there are 24 different actions that are prohibited by Title I of the ADA. And so we can look at those, and we've categorized them often in terms of job acquisition or getting the job, the conditions of employment, and also the retaining or keeping a job. So they tend to cluster into those areas. Sometimes we look at the issues in individual fashion, and sometimes we group them together. We can sort of expand and contract that depending on the specific research question. We look at predictors of merit closures. What are the factors in other aspects of the case that determine whether the EEOC will find that discrimination likely occurred or whether they find that this discrimination did not occur? That's the merit resolution rate. And we've done a number of studies looking at what are the drivers of those decisions by the EEOC. So by looking at characteristics of the charging party, the employer, and other aspects of the claim, we can predict with some reliability whether the EEOC is likely to determine that discrimination, did in fact occur. So that can be very important when people are thinking about making an allegation. You can actually hedge your bets about whether you're likely to succeed. Numbers of impact studies. We've looked at the impact of Supreme Court decisions that affected the ADA, the Sutton Trilogy, many of you are familiar with, the impact of the ADA Amendments Act. As I've mentioned, we've done some time series studies looking at workplace discrimination against certain groups of people, for example, within this database over time period and over phases of ADA implementation. We did a number of studies of the impact of the Great Recession of 2007 through about 2012 on people with disabilities. We also examined current trends related to the ADA, studying the discrimination experiences of people with emerging disabilities, of conditions whose nature really have changed over time, like people with HIV and AIDS. When HIV first came out, it was thought to be a terminal disease. Now it's a fairly manageable chronic illness. And how does that bear on stigma and treatment in the workplace and things of that nature? Influence of labor unions, some comparisons between states that have high levels of union security in their workforce, and those states that are known as work at will states. So these are just some of the things that we have accomplished so far in the database and in this overarching project, and we're looking forward to the next many years of learning even more as we go. But that's how we use the database, and those are some of the studies that we do. Now we want to go to the next slide. And Brian, this is a big slide, so I can see this. This depicts a group of people who are huddled together, perhaps in as in before a touch football down or something like that. And we want to share with you, it says a dozen here. I think, Brian, we've got 6 really key findings, general findings from our work on the ADA before we jump into the Helen Keller question. So with that, Brian, that's just a graphic slide. I will turn these over to you. And if you would, please start with important finding number 1.